Hello everyone. Today we are going to read the play Mother's Day and written by J.B. Priestley. Actually, the person whom we all adore next to God is our mother. We can never repay our debt to her. It is very ironical to note that the mother in the family gets her due. This play brings out the sad condition of the mother in the most of homes. A mother works from dawn to night and to satisfy the needs of her husband and children. She cleans and sweeps, she cooks and washes, but sadly, she gets no reward or praise for her labor. Her husband and children are most thoughtless. They never realize that she too is a human being and needs rest. We work for 5 days or 6 days in a week and claim it as a right to have a day or two off. But do we allow the same right to our mother? Don't mothers, to like of all of us, have a body that can get tired and a mind that can never be get bored? So don't they? To need some reaction, some recreation, or do we ever think it off? So if we don't, we need to be chastised in some way or other. So this is what the play is all about. So let's talk about the characters which have been introduced in this play. Mrs. Annie Pearson, the most important character, and George Pearson, her husband, Doris Pearson, Cyril Pearson, daughters and sisters, uh, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Mrs. Fitzgerald is a neighbor to Annie Pearson, and she is also playing a pivotal role in this play. The action of the story just takes place in the living room of the Pearson's house in a London suburb, and the time is present in the London suburb an area that is not located in the heart of the city, that is lying somewhere in the outskirts of a city. Now we just talk about the main points of the story to have a better understanding of all that we require. Actually, Mrs. Pearson's position in her family is not that good, and she is very fond of her husband and children, but they are thoughtless, they are selfish. The children, Cyril, the son, Doris, the daughter, take no notice of the mother. They treat her like a servant. And one day, Mrs. Fitzgerald offers a solution. And now, as a solution, they change their personalities. They change their personalities. And Mrs. Pearson's neighbor, she is Mrs. Pearson's neighbor, and Mrs. Fitzgerald, and offers to set the Pearson family right. She knows some magic, so some you can see some trace of supernatural element in this story also. So she knows some magic, and Mrs. Fitzgerald changes her personality with that of Mrs. Pearson. Now she looks like Mrs. Pearson, and Mrs. Pearson's looks like her, and Mrs. Fitzgerald sends Mrs. Pearson to her house for some time. Mrs. Pearson becomes firm and strict with the family. And what are the changes? And soon Mrs. Pearson's daughter Doris comes from work to home. She feels shocked to see her mother smoking. Actually, as we know that she is Mrs. Fitzgerald, the personalities have been interchanged, and playing cards. She gets a curt reply in incisive tone when she asks for tea which is not ready. The mother says she might go later for dinner at Clarendon. And Doris says angrily that she had been working all hard and yet she can't get even tea. So these are some changes which are noticed by the family members of Mrs. Pearson. Now Mrs. Pearson's son Cyril comes in. He is back from work. He feels annoyed to find that his mother has not prepared tea for him. He asks his mother if his shirt has been mended, and Mrs. Pearson replies sharply that she doesn't like mending. She is changed totally. And Cyril wonders what has happened to his mother. And Mrs. Pearson says that they all work for fixed hours in their offices. They have 2 days off a week. She announces that she will also have some days off in a week. So in the meantime, her husband George Pearson comes in. He notices Doris in tears. He looks at Mrs. Pearson sipping out at the odd hour of the day. He's surprised at her and annoyed to learn that there is no tea ready for him. His father told that he is one of the standing jokes for club members. So this time she is not, in the mood to leave her husband even, and they call him Pompey Ompy Pearson because he is so slow and pompous. And George is horrified. Her husband is horrified. He turns to Cyril for help, but Cyril only confirms mom's observation that is laughed at by club members at his back. So George leaves the room, much put out. Cyril angrily at mother and asks why she has hurt dad's feeling and his too. So her answers is that the truth ought not to hurt anybody. Secondly, if father did not go to the club, so often they would stop laughing at him. So all the three can hardly believe, all the three. Mrs. Pearson's son, Cyril, daughter Doris, and her husband, Mr. Pearson. So all the three can hardly believe the change they see in Mrs. Pearson. They have never seen her in such a terrible form, and now they all are scared of her. None dares, none dares her to oppose her in any way. Meanwhile, Mrs. Fitzgerald from next door knocks at the door. Cyril calls her a silly old woman, which is object to his mom. She's Latin. She inquires if everything is all right. Cyril doesn't like her interference in the family affairs. The mother silences him with a rebuke and calls him a silly, spoiled young pie can. But the next moment, the real Mrs. Pearson can no longer stand the shabby treatment of her family. George, Doris, and Cyril are asked to leave the room for some time. And now the family's attitude gets changed. The two ladies change back into their proper personalities, Mrs. Fitzgerald and Mrs. Pearson. And Mrs. Fitzgerald warns Mrs. Pearson not to go soft again or it would all be mere waste. So George, Doris, and Cyril now have changed a lot. They readily agree to do whatever Mrs. Pearson wants them to do. So the remaining part we are going to cover in the next video, and thank you very much.